morning, good evening, or good night, whichever one it is for you, whichever one it is. I'm very glad you're here to join me for this week's video. In this video, I don't really quite know what's gonna happen. I'm just gonna document what I read this week, which is gonna be interesting because I have uni now again. The semester has started, which means I have quite a lot of uni reading to do, which complicates the whole reading for yourself thing because I just don't have as much time. So the things I'm gonna be reading this week are a bit different. I'm not quite sure how many of the academic texts I'm going to have to be reading I'm going to document because I don't know how interesting that stuff is to you. But there's one thing that I'm going to talk about later, one book I have to read for uni. I have 3 weeks to read that, which is so much time. So that's not gonna be a problem at all. Other than that, I'm currently in the middle of a few, but I think I'll tell you about those as we go on. I usually don't do this, but we're gonna do something out of character today because usually I like to read books with you and then talk to you about them as I'm reading them. But I have finished a book recently. I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about this one, but I read it and I really do want to talk about this. So let me just quickly get it. It's Doktor Faustus by Thomas Mann, which is my fourth or fifth, I think my fourth Thomas Mann. And this month I've been reading a lot of Thomas Mann. Doktor Faustus was really interesting to me. I've talked about this premise before, which is why I was so intrigued by it, because Thomas Mann basically took Goethe's Faust, which is a very, very famous classical German piece of literature, and he wrote a story based on that, but he set his story during the uprise of fascism in Germany during the 1900s. And so that was a very intriguing premise to me, told through the perspective of a childhood friend of our main character. It's basically, he's called Dr. Zeitblum, and he is in his 60s as he's writing the story. And his childhood friend, Adrian Leverkühn, who's the main character of this story, has just died. Turns out Adrian was this very, very talented musician. He was like the most gifted musician of his generation. And he had a very interesting story. And apparently he had a story of mental decline towards his death. He died fairly young. And we switch between Zeitblum just writing down accounts of their past and also intersecting that with little meditations that he's currently doing. So it's basically, it switches between past and present and between talking about Adrian and talking about philosophy about the themes that we're talking about in the story. So it's a very interestingly told story. So basically Adrian, we meet him when he's really young, and we meet him during his childhood years with his childhood friend. And right from the start, he's a very interesting character because he seems very detached from people and from emotions. It's very clear that this friendship that Zeitblum, the narrator, and Adrian Leverkühn, the main character, have is entirely because of Zeitblum. Because Adrian he's very indifferent to everything, it seems like. He's sort of an alien creature in that way. But very quickly we learn that he's just really talented in music without ever having really made an effort. He's just naturally very gifted in it. And so music becomes his entire thing. Zeitblum tells us that Adrian has written him this letter. It's a literal documentation of a conversation Adrian has had with the devil, because Adrian has made a pact with the devil to ensure himself success and inspiration. He's documented that word by word, and he sent this document to his friend, to Zeitblum, the narrator, before his death. That's the thing that made Zeitblum want to write down this story of his friend. Obviously, the deal with the devil is inspired by Faust. It's the whole term Faustian deal is really where that comes from. It's interesting because Adrian is basically molded after Nietzsche's biography, because Nietzsche had a fairly similar sort of life story as Adrian, the main character in this story, does. Adrian is infected with syphilis when he's fairly young still, and that seems to play a large part in his sort of progressively worsening insanity that's taking place over this story. And you see him just detach himself further and further from real life and become this sort of obsessed, mad genius in a way. There's a lot of music philosophy in this and a lot of rambling. There's so many. This entire book is basically one conversation after another, which usually I really like. But in this case, it was so wildly boring, because I don't care for music philosophy that much. It's not something that interests me. In my opinion, it got so repetitive. The only thing I really liked in this story is the letter Adrian wrote about his conversation with the devil. That's incredibly interesting. Also, the times where we get to hear about what happens in Germany on a larger scale at the time, because we start out before the First World War. That's when Adrian and Zeitblum are kids. And then we follow them during the First World War and the years leading up to and during the Second World War. The parallel is quite interesting because Zeitblum writes the story during the last years of the Second World War, which is when Thomas Mann wrote this story. So that's a sort of interesting connection. Doktor Faustus was a very controversial work because it dealt with the collective fault of Germany in terms of what happened during the Second World War and the crimes against humanity that were committed. This was a topic that at the time where the Second World War had just finished, this book came out in 1947, which is when Germany was still very much in the tumultuous aftermath of the Second World War. Thomas Mann actually wrote this story during the Second World War because he was exiled to America, and that's where he wrote the story. He had the idea way before, but then the idea was he wanted to write a story based on Goethe's Faust, but the actual proper idea and the inspiration for this story, it took shape during the Second World War when he was in exile. And you can really tell the emotion behind the story. That being said, I did not really like it. I really wanted to like it, and this was the kind of story where I would have stopped reading it if I had a bit more of a self-preservation instinct, because usually, I'm not the kind of person who can just stop reading a book. It really has to take a lot for me to just DNF something. With this book, I feel kind of bad that I read it because I knew fairly early on that I was not gonna like it, but I was still I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt, because what if it surprised me? Sadly, it never did. I just did not find the amount of philosophical ramblings about music interesting. That's not something that's in line with what I like to think about. It's just a personal thing, I think. I like the parts about the Second World War and what happened in Germany at the time, and I found the letter Adrian wrote about his deal with the devil incredibly interesting. But everything else I did not like. I thought there were way too many characters and the focus of the story was really lacking to me. You never really follow anyone in depth. You never get an in-depth view into anyone. Adrian Leverkühn is the main character, but other than the one letter you get from him, you're never actually in his head. So you never actually get to know him, which stylistically I understand because he's this really detached sort of anti-human being. But still, it made the story very uninteresting to read or very unengaging to read. I'm just not the right audience for it, I think. I now feel like I have a fairly varied view into Thomas Mann's work. I've decided to probably never pick up another Thomas Mann because I think I now know that he's maybe just not the author for me, which is a personal thing, and I feel kind of bad about it. I think he's a very good author. I just don't think he's the author for me, because although the concepts are always interesting, and although I really love the historic aspects of his stories, and especially in The Magic Mountain, the philosophy of it, I found incredibly interesting, but still I've never read one of his books that I have not been bored during or that I felt really good reading. So yeah, maybe we're just not the right fit. That being said, I do think he's a very worthwhile author to read, and I think give him a shot because this is a very individual kind of thing. I know many people love this man, and he's a classical author for a reason. He's clearly very skilled and very intelligent. You could really like him potentially. That's it for Doktor Faustus. Now I'm gonna have to read my uni book because I do have to finish that. We're gonna do that, and we'll see each other again soon. Bye! Didier Eribon is a French sociologist who was friends with a lot of important thinkers of the field, for example, Bourdieu and Simone de Beauvoir, and he implements their theories and their works, but he puts his own spin on them, and he does create his own sort of sociological view of the world. The technical term for this book is an auto-sociobiographical story, meaning he's basically writing an autobiography, but he's implementing sociological viewpoints, and he's also focusing on the society that surrounds his life. And so it's sort of a combination. It's not entirely scientific because it's too individual and too subjective to be scientific, but it's still a very fascinating insight into this one man's life, because he basically grew up in the working class, in a lower class family in France, and he was gay as well. And so the topic of shame is a lot of what he talks about, both in terms of the inacceptance he was faced by his family because of his identity, because he never felt like he could be himself with his family, and also because of his shame towards his social standing, because he has a lot of class shame. And so those two aspects sort of lead him to cut off all contact with his family for years when he's still very young. In his books, he basically deals with this decision he made, and he tries to analyze what led to that. And so he basically comes to the realization that maybe it's not just because I was gay and my family didn't accept me, but maybe it's because I was so ashamed of where I came from. He basically he uses education to raise his social standing, and he manages to do that, but that sort of separates him from his family more, because he has to sort of cut off his identity with his family, this identity he grew up in order to create this entirely new identity. He completely reinvents himself. In this book, he deals with his mom, because after cutting off contact, he wrote this book, Retour à Reims, which is about everything I've just talked about. And then this one is him talking about his mom aging after he has come back into contact with his mom, because basically after his father died, it was much easier for him to be in contact with his mother, because his relationship with his father was very bad. He never felt accepted by his dad, and so when he died, tried to force himself to be closer to his mom because he felt like that was his duty. This book is him basically talking about how his mom has to go into a care facility for seniors. I don't know, Altersheim is in German the word, or Pflegeheim, I don't know what the technical term is. But what this book brings up a lot, and I found that so fascinating, is the move to a care facility as a senior. That's basically you moving to the place you know you're gonna die in. It's being immediately confronted with the mortality of humanity. And it puts you in this state that's so unlike anything else a person could be in. It's also this sort of, it reminded me of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain in a way, because it talks about how microscopic this society in this care facility is, and how the behavior of others really influences the people that move in. Eribon mentions that his mom has never really had a problem walking, but as soon as she moves into the care facility, she starts to really have difficulty walking. She gets really hunched over suddenly, and she walks really slowly because everyone else walks like that in the care facility. And so it's as much about the physical decline of a person while aging as it is about the mental aspect of it, because it's about his mom really fighting for her independence but also just having lost it completely. It's this dichotomy of what she wants to be capable of and what her body is allowing her to be capable of, but from the viewpoint of her son, who's also really affected by this, because of course you don't want your loved one to go through that. And so it's a really insightful and also very hard to read. It's been fascinating. It's a kind of book I haven't read before. Being reacquainted with all of these thinkers I already know, Foucault for example, or Bourdieu. It's really interesting to see that from the point of view of someone else in an autobiographical book. That's not something that usually happens to me. So yeah, I'm gonna keep reading this now, and we'll see each other again whenever I pick up another book to talk about with you. Bye! Alright, so we're outside, and I thought, why not end this video here, because it's a really nice day and I was outside anyway. The one thing I have not said to you yet is, first of all, I've been reading so much Stephen King because, I don't know, that's my current obsession, I suppose. I've been reading, what have I been reading? Mr. Mercedes and Finders Keepers, which are the first two books in the Mr. Mercedes or Bill Hodges trilogy, I suppose. It's the first two books in a trilogy, and the third one I'm going to start today. I have really been liking those. I also read or tried to read Desperation, but I stopped reading that. I gave it back already because I did not like that book at all, which I really am not someone who DNFs books. I force myself to finish them for better or for worse, which is sometimes not a good thing because that's just why read a book that you're not going to enjoy, where you already know you're just going to give it a bad review or you're just not going to like it? But yeah, sort of my competitive instinct just wants to finish it, to give it all the shots I can give it before deciding I hate it. Desperation is one of the only books I've ever given up on reading. I got 200 pages into it and I just did not like it. Desperation is basically the story of many different people who, through circumstances, get stranded in this one town in the middle of the desert in America, and very sinister things happen there. And I did not get far enough into it to even really know what's going on, but the way it was written, with Stephen King, there's several things that bug me, that really annoy me sometimes, but they're never extreme enough for me to really hate a book. Like, for example, the way he talks about black people, his black characters, that rubs me the wrong way. I don't think that's very well done. It makes me quite uncomfortable sometimes, but it's never that in your face where you just cannot read the story. At least in the books I've read so far. I cannot speak for all of his works. But with Desperation, also the way men talk about women. Women are constantly sexualized, and in Desperation is a really brutal story. It's really mean, and it's such a sinister story, but the men in the book are constantly, even in situations where your life is in danger, sexualizing the woman. And that just took me out of it so much, and it made me hate the book, really hate the book, which does not often happen. And it just felt so pointless, and it kept happening, and I kept thinking, okay, one more time, it's okay, maybe it'll stop now, maybe we'll get into the gist of the things, but no, it kept happening, and I could not deal with it anymore. And so I decided I'm gonna put my own mental well-being first and not force myself to read this book. Because I've just been stressed anyway, because uni has started back up. I've talked about that already, and that's just always very stressful for me, because for one, it changes my routine completely, which I do not like. I thrive on my routine. I need that structure in my life because my mind is always in chaos, and so I just like my outside world to be very structured, but that's just not possible when your routine constantly changes. And this is like the biggest change when uni starts back up. Also, it just reminds me how difficult it is for me to be around people, which sort of sometimes it makes me feel like I'm just sort of broken or not made right, because you always think that people are supposed to like being around other people, but I feel so uncomfortable when people are around me, which is not the nicest thing to be reminded of. It always feels like, why are these things so difficult for me when they seem so easy to other people? But it's good to challenge yourself, and it'll become easier, I hope, once I get accustomed to this new thing. And it's not forever, it'll be over soon. And yeah, meanwhile, I have all of these books that comfort me. I've been reading so many comforting books. And honestly, the good thing about these kinds of times is that they really remind me why I love reading so much, because especially when my life sort of becomes really difficult, it's so nice to have these things that comfort you and these worlds to escape into. And this is when I usually read the most, because it's just, reading is the only thing that comforts me and that puts me out of my own head for a little while, which is so comforting. And yeah, so thank goodness we have literature in our lives. It's such a gift. It's such a gift, and I appreciate it so much. And yeah, that's maybe the positive note. Let's just end this on a good note. Literature is awesome. We love literature. So yeah, I'm gonna leave now, gonna walk the dog some more, enjoy the weather. And I hope you're having a nice day. If you're not having a nice day, I'm thinking of you. I'm sending you all the good vibes. Okay, the dogs are barking, so I'm gonna leave now. See you very soon. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.